Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Matt Edmonds and I'm from Pre-Construct Archaeology, and I'm going to talk about the Priory of the Virgin Mary and John the Baptist, also known as Holywell Priory, which is an Augustinian nunnery from foundation to dissolution. As I'm not a historian or sort of medieval expert, this is going to be an archaeological perspective. But with the fact that we've had investigations on this site over a 30-year period, and specifically the last 7 years of PCA involvement, there's quite a lot to cover. So the archaeological perspective should be an interesting talk. Okay. We're starting off with this map, which is the main religious houses in medieval London. And you start to sort of see Holywell Priory to the northeast. We've got the sister chapel, which is sister priory, which is also Augustinian, which is St Mary, Clerkenwell, and then we also have the Holy Trinity Priory, which is an Augustinian priory over in towards Aldgate. And just sort of locators within London, got the River Thames there, Shoreditch High Street coming into Bishopsgate, across London Bridge and into Southwark, and then you've got Bermondsey Abbey over here to sort of the southeast, which our colleague Alistair Douglas will talk about later. Just to sort of just give a bit of size, I mean, that is a 9-acre site, so much smaller than somewhere like Bermondsey Abbey, but still this is where we'll be focusing this talk. Just going to draw your attention to this plaque, which is on modern day Curtain Road in Shoreditch, put up by the London Borough of Hackney, which is where we are, and it's the only real visible marker to the presence of Holywell Priory. Just to sort of the bit of information we've got here, this area formed part of Holywell Priory, founded 1152, 1158. There's some uncertainty about that foundation date, but it's around about that time, and dissolved in 1539 in the dissolution, and it was named after a holy well, and it's bounded by Curtain Road, Holywell Lane, Bateman Row and Shoreditch High Street. So hopefully with this lecture we're going to find out a little bit more about Holywell Priory. We'll know more about it than just this singular plaque. So this is a map of 1922, and it puts it into its setting of some of the streets. So here we've got Shoreditch High Street to the east, Holywell Lane to the south, Finsbury Field, which is now Curtain Road, to the west, and then the Bateman's Row. So like I said, it covers about 9 acres, and probably would have had about 13 nuns at its peak, and with additional workers sort of helping with maintaining the gardens, and cooking, baking, sort of maybe a brew house, sort of domestic duties, so the nuns can focus on their devotion. Just a few sort of little bits. We've got a church to the south, and then the rest of the priory to the north. That is a sort of, sometimes the church is to the north, but in this case we've got it to the south. And our excavation, our sort of work focuses on this little area to the south, with a bit of the church and a bit of this sort of piece of land where you've got a gatehouse and a cemetery wall, and just some of these sort of details in this kind of part of the general priory area, between the sort of outer precinct. Just a quick sort of site location and put it in its modern context. We've got Shoreditch High Street to the east again, Holywell Lane to the south, and then that is focusing on that sort of southeastern area of the overall priory. Just sort of previous archaeological interventions, just to sort of where we're getting our information from. Previously in 1989, Barney Sloan, who was working for the Department of Greater London Archaeology, or DOGLA, conducted these trenches across the site, and that was the real start of the excavations back in 1989, and sort of part of the works being done. Later, we've got Museum of London in 2006 carried out 3 trenches in advance of the London Overground East London line, which sort of cuts diagonally across the site, and their findings start to build up a bit of a picture of the Priory Church, which we'll see later. So over to what the works have done PCA more recently in 2019. So the Overground Viaduct is in place, so it cuts through the site, and over on that western side we've got the advance of a building of a hotel and a residential block, which allowed us to excavate down the western side of the site. In addition, much more recently in 2019, we did a few trenches to the north and to the south in this area here. These are the areas highlighted in yellow, so orange. So we started to build up a real picture of the Dogler trenches, the Molar trenches, the PCA trenches, and our 2019 trenches. And that was more recent. This area here, which was done in 2020, last year, where we've got a larger area of excavation, and over to the east of the Overground Viaduct, so PCA trenches sort of site in 2015 to the west, and then over to the east of that overground line with this more recent excavation area. So focusing back on that 1922 plan, we're going to look at this sort of area. So we're capturing this bit of the church, this bit of sort of outer precinct defined by the wall here, and then the gatehouse, and then the curtain wall to the south. So we're going to sort of see what we find with those excavations, how we build on this picture. And there's a few sort of things that worth pointing out. The gatehouse here, the little entrance, but the church overall is quite plain. It doesn't really give a lot of information. It's just a rectangular block, but we're going to add to that over the course of this lecture. So here we are, the results of the Molar excavation, one of their trenches here, and the previous 1989 evaluation by Barney Sloan, where we've got a cruciform church, sort of conjectured by the north wall they found, and the south wall, and some columns here. And then they thought they had a bit of the transept based on what Barney Sloan was finding, and a small chapel over here to the west of the transept. But they're starting to build up a picture of how that church would look from this conjecture. So this church was, like we said, was found around 1150, but actually this church what we've got here is probably from 1190, where it starts to take this kind of cruciform shape. And there's a cruciform shape on the church at St Mary's, Clerkenwell, which is one of the other main Augustinian priories in London. So focusing on the PCA excavations, will bring us back to this area here of this 1922 plan with the gatehouse and then the church itself, and that matches kind of the results of those excavations of the 2015 excavations, where we've got the gatehouse here, we've got a roadway leading up here, and at each sort of stage I'm going to break this down and go through some of these sort of different parts with the gatehouse, the avenue, the south wall with the entrance, the actual church itself, the north wall, and then the western range. So we're starting to add to this very rectangular block church. And then onto the gatehouse here, we've got the east-west curtain wall, which we actually had survival of, and then some rooms which form part of the gatehouse, and then the entrance to the gatehouse here, and then that's conjectured the curtain walls kind of running off there, carrying off to the east on that side and the west on that side. So on to the next slide. And here we are with a photograph of that east-west curtain wall, and then the far room that we sort of looked at on that plan over there to the west, a smaller room here over to the east, and then looking at the gateway kind of coming in here. Just a bit of a detail on the outside of the curtain wall on the along Holywell Lane. We think we've got a well, this rectangular structure here, we believe is a well, which actually probably is where the name Holywell, it kind of gets its name from. There probably was a natural spring on this site, and it's been formalised by this well, and it's added on to that curtain wall. And here's just an elevation to show you how it's sort of constructed. This is a bit more of just a sort of an example of that gatehouse. We've got a two gateways, which is the main carriageway gate and then a postern gate. And this is an example from Bristol, the main entrance to St Augustine's Abbey in Bristol. And it's maybe how ours are looked. Obviously, it's a lot more elaborate higher up. We haven't got that sort of information, but we sort of just in terms of a gateway with a main carriageway gate and a postern gate, that's how we believe our gatehouse looked for Holywell. And then just focusing on this plan here, the avenue that would have taken us from the gatehouse to the church along this western side, we had patches of gravel, which would have been a metalled surface which forms this avenue, this routeway between those two sort of buildings. And then we're getting on to the actual doorway to the church, which we've got surviving in this photograph, which we're calling a Portico Entrance. And this is the western end of the south wall. It was built into that south wall. And there was a similar example of a Portico Entrance at St Mary's in Clerkenwell, and that had a tower extending from that from that entranceway. Or sort of, we haven't got that information at the moment to sort of extrapolate that, but it's quite a nice bit of survival here of this Portico Entrance. Focusing now onto the south wall of the church, which has got really nice survival. I mean, a lot of these walls often survive just with chalk foundations, or they've been gobbed out. Here we've actually got standing wall made up of Kentish ragstone. There's a bit of Reigate, a bit of Carnstone, and quite a rough sort of sandy mortar as a bonding material. And then probably on the external face of this wall, we did find some render, so the stones themselves probably wouldn't be exposed, and it was just sort of rendered and possibly painted, but it's a really good survival of the south wall of the church. And then onto our church plan. So just sort of just recap here. We've got the Portico Entrance coming fixed onto the south wall, the south aisle, some columns to the south, then the nave, and then these northern columns, and then the north wall of the church, and then the north aisle, and then we're getting into the cloister, where we've got this sort of western wall that sort of defines that cloister alley, and some rooms coming off that cloister alley. Here we have a kind of nice photograph of that survival I'm talking about, that really nice survival with that south wall, Portico Entrance. We've got the columns, and then we've got the nave to the sort of north of that. This is kind of looking west. And then these cuts here are the graves within that south aisle, so there are bodies buried below the floor within the church itself, which is quite nice. Then onto the column bases. Just sort of not much to say really, but except really good survival. They've got stone pier bases, which you can see here, and they're circular columns with kind of very sort of quite plain column here, but a little bit more of an interesting one here. But again, really good survival, sort of nice architectural features, when they would have supported the arcade in the south aisle. And here we go, we're looking now inside the church, looking south in the north aisle towards the nave, and this is a spread of Westminster tiles, which is really, really good survival, and quite an impressive thing to find. And there's just a bit more detail of those Westminster tile. We think sort of 13th century. They've got strong connections with other monastic sites, and they were the common tile type in St Mary, Clerkenwell, just to give it a bit of context. And actually our spread that we've got here, that we found with PCA, was the largest spread of tiles outside of Westminster Abbey. Lots of typical designs that have been seen before, but we think, and our experts think, there's probably one or two that are new and probably not seen in other assemblages. So these are sort of items that probably been added later during this church's life, as maybe the priory comes into money, and benefactors that maybe favour the Augustinian order at that time, sort of donating money, and they're allowed to sort of add these sort of extra, if you like, a bit of luxury to the church, a bit of nice sort of architectural feature. And again, that's following on from that theme. We found these late medieval bricks, which kind of would have gone into a vaulted ceiling, like the example on this photograph. And again, sort of had a bit of suggestion that the priory's money was coming in at different stages during its life, and bits could be added, and they could kind of move with the times, if you like. So just on that, into the cloisters, I mean, we did find this survival here. So you've got the north wall of the church, the cloister alley, and then this bit of wall here with a little sort of internal wall coming off, and then that's sort of shown here. So you've got this, if you imagine this being the other way, so you've got that internal piece of wall separating that those two rooms there, which is that piece of foundation there, and then this main kind of north-south wall, which is that bit there. Right, just to sort of a bit of just to revise what we've kind of been through. So we're sort of adding to this conjecture here from the Molar conjecture, and it's sort of with the 2015 excavations, we've added this portico entrance, and we're sort of focused on the western end of the church. We found this bit of south wall, this bit of north wall, these columns that separate the south aisle, the north aisle, and then the nave, and then you've got the cloister alley here, which we've sort of found during this excavation. So this brings us into sort of 2019, 2020 excavations, which are on the western side of this, sorry, the eastern side of the viaduct, and we're focusing on the eastern end of the church. And that's where we come in here with the 2019 excavations. One of the first parts we did in 2019 was we revealed, which we think is which we know is the eastern end and the south wall of the church. And it's great survival because we've got this much later build on top, quite a late sort of post-med build, which became a property boundary in this part of Shoreditch, and if that property boundary allowed that wall to survive. Just sort of bringing a bit more detail that we showing this south wall as we excavated it. Over the course of that 2019 excavation, we revealed a full sort of 20-metre long section of wall and the different elements along it. So I'm just going to focus on these two elements, this particularly being this western end, where we've got this late post-med blocking. So we think this would be in an open space and not a continuous wall, and at some point during the post-medieval period it's been blocked in with chalk and brick and sort of various masonry elements. And then just to sort of look at the main build of the wall, so we've got the foundation, which is chalk and gravel in sort of sandwich layers, and then some stone just to sort of start the foundation courses, continuing from the chalk, and then that starts into the wall itself, which is predominantly Kentish ragstone, fairly roughly sort of made. Whether it had been rendered, we're not sure, like we'd seen in our 2015 excavations. And then just to sort of a little bit more, we think this has got to be sort of looked at a bit more closely, but we think the church ends round about this kind of area, and this wall that continues to the east towards Shoreditch High Street would have been a boundary wall between the outer precinct to the south and the inner precinct to the north. So it's been maybe described as a garden wall. I see it as a boundary wall between those two different areas of the priory. So that's quite an interesting sort of change from the church to the priory boundary. And this is a bit more of an aerial view of that south wall, and then some of the elements during that excavation that we started to look at here. So we think we've got a north-south wall here with an east-west return, which we think is possibly the transept, and then a wall coming off it and a chapel that's been added, a little cell to that north-south wall. So that's just showing these elements as that we recovered, that were revealed during these 2019 excavation. And then there's a little bit of some sort of survival here that we'll look at later. And then there's that garden wall running through here, this precinct wall. So on to the 2020 excavations, which carried on from the south of that south wall. So there's now, that south wall does survive, and they constructed a pile wall to build this as part of the development, part of the building that's going to be built here. And this allowed us to sort of do these excavations in 2020, and we started to reveal a bit more information about the transept and about some of these additional cells that were added to that south wall at this eastern end of the church. And as we go on through this lecture, I'll show you some of these elements. So here's some photographs showing the things that were revealed during that 2020 excavation. This is looking south, and there's several phases in these photos. And at the moment there's preliminary phasing, as we've not really drilled down on the post-ex process to really sort of unpick that phasing. So what we're looking at here is an inner chapel, and then an outer wall constructed much later with a buttress coming off down here, and then this outer wall, and then this inner chapel. So different, it's already starting to see several phases of construction there. And then these are identified by the robber cuts, probably from robbing carried out during the dissolution in 1539. And then the only things that survive is the chalk foundations and then stone foundations, which we think in the later phase. And then this is just another image looking southeast of this chapel with this later wall added with this buttress off to the southeast. And then this is some phasing we've got here. This is sort of our very early stages of phasing. So phasing plans from the 2019-2020 excavation combine, and we've got this little chapel here that's added on to the transept and then the south wall. So this is probably from our 1190 church, that cruciform church identified by Molar, they're added to during the 2015 excavations, and even further added to during these excavations. In addition, we've got this little chapel on the eastern end of that transept, and we add to that with another chapel that's sort of added, probably is later than 1190, maybe even sort of additions round about the middle of the 14th century. Then this gets even more interesting with our later phase. So our inner sort of chapel has gone, and this outer replaced by this much larger sort of outer wall, if you like, very late medieval, we think, with the foundations with these buttresses known as French buttresses, sort of round about 1400 onwards. These start to come in fashion during that kind of late medieval period. We've question marked here whether this is Lord Lovell's chapel. This is going to be a 15th, early 16th century edition if it is, and he was quite important potentially in Holywell Priory's life. He was Chancellor of the Exchequer at the time, and he's thought to have moved into the outer precinct and was potentially quite an important benefactor for that priory. But these interesting structural elements to the church to the east of the transept that were revealed during our excavations, and it'd be interesting to find out really if this is Lord Lovell's chapel, but that is something for a later piece of work. So here we go, just a quick sort of look at this towards the far eastern side of the site, away from the church. We've got this boundary ditch, and this is defining the precinct along that edge. Quite a large ditch, or quite a large, it's a large segment of what would have been a large ditch, and we believe it's medieval, but I think we have to do a bit more work on that, and probably had a bank along this side, and then it was being filled in, maybe as more land was acquired during the course of the priory's life. But at the moment, this is it's quite a nice sort of defining eastern boundary ditch. And then here we are, the south wall again, and we're starting to reveal a priory cemetery. So between that kind of transept, that eastern end of the church, and towards Shoreditch High Street, we're getting an area of cemetery, and that was revealed in the 2019 excavations along this south wall into this inner outer precinct wall. And there is our cemetery, our overview, with about 200 skeletons exhumed, sort of Christian burials, kind of east-west, a range of different ages, male and female. At the moment, we haven't done much post-text work, so we do need to kind of look at that in a bit more detail, and we'll sort of talk about the results in due course. This is just a quick overview of that cemetery. One of the things that was quite common was because the cemetery is probably in use for about 300 years, we've got a individual who's been buried, but when they put that grave in, they disturbed an earlier grave, and rather than rebury it in a different area, they've decided just to lay it on the legs of this particular individual. So a bit of sort of earlier graves disturbed by later burials and then managed in this way. Then we're looking at quite an age range. So this is a very young child, about 7 years old, and then an even younger child of 6 months to 1 year. So mostly adults, but there are children. So maybe we're starting to look at not just nuns buried here, but the wider community from Hackney and Shoreditch during the medieval period. And then a bit of pathology, just to sort of close up on this lower arm of this particular individual. Has had a break which has healed, and there's a slight misalignment, which is why it's got that sort of swelling on the arm like that. And then just a bit of status. I mean, we've got these chapels which I talked about earlier, and these are 3 burials within that chapel. So quite possibly higher status individuals getting a much better burial plot within a chapel rather than being in the general cemetery with everybody else. That's quite an interesting element to this excavation. A bit more about this sort of status in terms of how these bodies were treated. I mean, this is in the south transept. We did have coffin nails around the bodies, but no survival of timber. This does seem to have some survival of that timber. And this individual, unfortunately, the coffin is flooded, so the bones have moved, and that's why they're in this kind of sort of mixed position where they've raised by the water and then dropped like that. So that explains that. And then there's a burial, some grave goods on some of these burials, not very common for the medieval period, but in this particular case, we're seeing things like there's a small coin on the teeth of the lower jaw. In this case, we're having lead parcels placed in the graves by the mourners, and there's 3 examples of this. This is one of the better ones, where we believe a piece of parchment with a prayer or something written in Latin perhaps is placed and folded within inside that lead, and then it's placed within the grave as something that the mourners are trying to convey through that item. And here we have a burial of a priest with a mortuary chalice over by its right shoulder, and that's why we know it's a priest. There's several examples of this. So in the church, the priest will take mass. In the priory, it has to be a male priest to do that. And then this is the sign of when the priest is buried. He's often buried with this mortuary chalice, which is lead pewter. And there's a close-up of the mortuary chalice that was found on another burial in 2015 on the excavations we did in that part of the church. We did find a priest with this particular example of this chalice, originally in silver, but then replaced by lead or pewter when the burial takes place. And there we have a buckle from an item of clothing here found on the hip of this individual, and then again that lead parcel, just a bit more close up of that so you can just see how that looks. A finger ring found on an individual buried in the south transept, so again a sort of suggestion of status here, quite a nice item of jewellery. And then devotional objects, one here we've got, which is the double cross, and then the crucifix. So it just reminds us we are in a religious building, we're on a religious site. And then a little bit of sort of nice ivory pin, quite a nice little small find there, and then an annular brooch. And then here, just a kind of general overview of just to sort of sum up really. So we started with our Molar conjecture, which had this cruciform church, and then we've added to that. So this is what they found: a little bit of that north wall, a little bit of that south wall, a bit of those columns, and then here we've really sort of added to that whole overall view of the church. So we've expanded on this information. We've revised that model set by Molar, especially at this eastern end with our Portico Entrance, and then the Westminster tiles, and then the western end with our chapel and our bit of transept, and then this sort of nice piece of wall here. And then there's got this, just a sort of quick reminder where we are with the cemetery area, and then the boundary ditch over to the east. And then just to end, this is a Wingard's panorama of London 1540 with our Priory Church nicely sort of represented there. Thank you. That's hope you enjoyed that lecture.